we'll kick off. Oh, we need some Indigenous focused elevator music. Sorry, that should have been my job to do that. Yeah, that'd be great, Lynn.
Okay, great. So we're at 33. I think I need to smudge again. We're just going to wait a little bit for some folks to get on board before we get started.
Here's some elevator music.
There we go. Jamie Gwetch Percy. Someone's asking what song is that?
That was from Voices of Attawapiskwat. I want to bring attention to that because it was International Water Day, and that was a fundraiser for the Boil Water Advisory for Attawapiskwat and Shannon Stream. So that was the name of the CD, and that was a traveling song by Marie Godet.
Nice, Miigwech. So it's almost 6:05. We're going to get started. We have about 42 attendees, but we want to get going to be respectful of your time. I'm going to start by introducing myself. Minidunebe Kwayandishnakaz, Wawashkiji and Dodam, Sudbury and Dijiba, Anishinaabe Métis Kwayandao, Nindawe Maga, Nindog, Nindujaba, Swan Lake, Temiskaming, and Timmins. Welcome all. I want to first introduce myself before I get to some logistics. There were some questions that we received. When you register, you're able to ask what you'd like us to address, and some folks wanted us to say who we are and where we come from. So I'm Lynn LaValle, Anishinaabe Métis Register with the Métis Nation of Ontario, and I introduced myself and my people and where they're from, particularly because of the cultural fraud that we see when opportunities are provided to Indigenous people. My mom and her family, the last names include LaBelle, Lafont, Godin, McIver, LaRock, Swain, Lilly, Korchesny, David, Guibosh, Carpenter, Chartrand, Roy, and Carrier, to name a few. And the regions that people come from are Swan Lake in Manitoba, Mariopolis, Maniwaki, Gracefield, and Timmins. My dad and many generations are from the Temiskaming region on both sides of the river. Last names there are LaValle, Gauthier, Pepin, Richard, Taylor, McKay, Champagne, Marion, Blodeau, to name a few. I was born in Sudbury, grew up in Toronto's Regent Park, and currently I'm on the traditional territory of the Chippewas of Georgina Island. Just some logistics. As last week, the Q&A is open and you can type your questions whenever you like. We might get back to it in writing. All of us are going to be paying attention to the Q&A. The chat function is closed. As you heard when you joined, we are recording this, and we do have a YouTube link, which is in the chat section, I believe. Brian, right? Yes, so we're doing YouTube live as well, and you'll be able to watch the YouTube live afterward, or not the live, it won't be live, it'll be recorded, but you'll be able to watch that afterwards. So without further ado, I want to take it over to Taima to do a brief introduction about this group and how we came together.
Thank you, Miigwech, Professor Lynn LaValle, and Katie and Brian for hosting and organising these webinars. Kia ora, ani, warm greetings. Welcome to those joining our webinar for the first time, and welcome back to those who joined us last week. My name is Taima Moike Pickering. I use the pronoun she, her. I'm a full professor in the School of Indigenous Relations at Laurentian University, Sudbury, Ontario. I'm from the Ngāti Pūkeko and Tūhoe tribes. I've lived in Sudbury for 15 years, and my home and university are based on the traditional territory of a Tigmishing Anishinaabe First Nation. We are Indigenous intellectuals talking forward about our experiences of being a professor, a researcher and scholar in academia. We amplify experiences of oppression, racism and sexism in the hope that our voices lay solid traits for positive transformational change across all parts of academia. Why? Because Indigenous ways in being matter to us. Over the last 5 months, our group from Australia, Aotearoa, and across provinces in Canada have been Zooming, emailing, and Twittering, if that's a word. Wait, what about this word? Or social media rising. Someone in our group has to be the octopus. We are proud Indigenous intellectuals, reclaiming our cultural intellectualism and bringing our distinct Indigenous worldviews into academia. We acknowledge the devastating impacts of colonisation on our peoples and the intergenerational trauma, grief and loss that is still affecting ourselves and our communities today. And this is what drives us, and why mentorship is vital for Indigenous students and scholars, and why it is meaningful for us. Good mentorship gives us the courage to speak up, share our brave talk, and provide us with that kind and gentle nudge to keep moving forward. And now we're bringing our strategies to you all via the second webinar. You can also find us on Twitter and our website, which has our blogs as well as recordings of our webinars. Thank you for joining us. I will now turn this part over to our amazing moderator, Professor Sandy O'Sullivan.
No pressure. Amazing, hey? Thank you so much for that, Taima, and thank you, Lynn. And thanks, Lynn, for hosting this. It's been a really interesting way to be able to engage and to have other people come in on the conversation, asking questions. I'll be picking up some of those questions as we go through, but we have one central question that we're going to ask. I'll start by introducing myself and kicking it off, mostly because we want to be able to wrap up in this today in the work that we're doing and that we're presenting a little bit about what we're focused on. And I want to start by talking about who I am. So I'm a Wiradjuri person. Wiradjuri is a country that's in the middle of the state that's now known as New South Wales, in the country that's now known as Australia. And it's we have over 300 countries in this kind of meta-colonial structure of Australia. And I'm a transgender non-binary person. I'm very interested in our diversities. And the D word is one of those words that's really tricky. It's less about reclaiming this idea, but more about actually a positively charged way of thinking about complexity. So you know, one of the problems when we buy into the colonial project of gender is that it reduces us. And everything that we can do to challenge that reduction is the work that I really hope to do. I'm made incredibly richer by connecting with the people here. You know, it's funny, when Tyler said 5 months, I thought, has it been that long? And also, has it only been that long? You know, so it's been an absolute joy to be connected to it. In 2020, just last year, middle of last year, I was told that I was funded by the Australian government to, believe it or not, to undertake a 4-year program that is made up of smaller projects, but it's examining the ways that queer First Nations creative practitioners create impact and influence with their work. So the program's called Saving Lives, Mapping the Influence of LGBTIQ+ First Nations creative artists. The project explores how creativity, so I'm reading this off, has been used to demonstrate our reality and potential as queer First Nations peoples. But I'm also really interested in reframing this from the idea of influence to one of insistent power, because I'm also thinking beyond how we might just persuade, but also how queer First Nations peoples position themselves and their work to create resistance and to embody whatever that power means. And so that's the work I'm doing. The Saving Lives thing, it's kind of two things. One is, yeah, it's making a space where people can see the meaningful connections in their lives, you know, and where for people who, for whatever reason, maybe it's their family, the community, is not supported through their growth in terms of their gender and sexuality, that they're actually able to engage that with this broader network of people making, thinking, who are working towards creating a space that people can engage with. So that's the work I'm really interested in. It's not writing things up, and it's not going and asking questions and then putting it into an academic journal. It's making a resource that's accessible to community, because it doesn't work otherwise. It's all those other things too. So, and one thing that I will just redirect at some stage is Dr. Tess Ryan, who couldn't be here today, has asked me to just relay some notes actually for her about the way that she has felt really both connected and disconnected from the academy. She'll be here to talk about it again, but she kind of wanted to push this through this week, so I hope you don't mind that. And you might notice, I'm not sure if it shows up on this, but I also use Wajin as well as they and them, which is non-gendered pronoun in Wiradjuri, my language. So I'm going to throw it over to Percy, no pressure. And that's just the first time that's happened during this session. I'm going to ask if you can introduce yourself, of course, but also if you can tell us what's the most pressing issue in your field or in the community, and what does it mean to you in this whole idea of being an Indigenous intellectual?
Oof. Oh, why haskell how and Jacken cook salala chichuaska. Why lemlem Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Cree, Huron, Wendat, Mississaugas of the New Credit as per the Indian Act. I want to give thanks to the generous hosts who allow me to continue to be a guest on the homelands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Three Fire Confederacy. My people, my mother's people, are from out west in colonially named and unceded British Columbia, the interior of Skellig. But I want to respect all the ways in which my people introduce themselves as Silch, Sukunau Kaint, and Skellig. And even in my colonial name, I have my first and my last Indian Act name, but I've centered Minimchilks, which is the Injilkan way to introduce gender diversity in terms of they. And then I use the English they, them, theirs. I am I currently am, until July, at the Wilfrid Laurier Brantford campus in Indigenous Studies. Prior to that, I was in social work. And that's where I started my academic career under the tutelage and collegial connections with Dr. Lynn LaValle at formerly alumni, me, myself, of Ryerson University. So a lot of the work that I do is not really actually directed by the institution. Maybe that's why I don't have an appointment, or I'm not preparing for my full professorship by now, and I'm still scrambling in precarity. So that's going to speak volumes about my particular experiences, and I want to nuance the ways in which the academic industrial complex continues to, by virtue of omission and deflection, pushes out Indigenous scholars and scholarship, pushes out the ways in which they do outreach to students, and the recidivism, the dropout rates, because of because the academic industrial complex has really predetermined what community and priorities are, right? I'm constantly reflecting and asking myself, am I responding or reacting to neoliberalism, the notions of neoliberalism? If I just work hard enough, right? I will have arrived, or whatever arrival means, right? Am I responding or reacting to colonialism? Am I being beaten into submission, much like those Indigenous scholars before me have been asked to maneuver and replicate? That's which I'm barely surviving, and especially those I share community with. And am I responding or reacting to white supremacist work culture, as this culture is set up to work against me, as Kinskeloch, as Stamia, Two-Spirit, or as Meninchilks, or some with disabilities, right? And the many different communities that I'm actually accountable to. And that I'm constantly being positioned against white professionalism standards related to dress code, the speech, the word choiceage, the language, right? Work style, timelines, and perfectionism. Am I responding or reacting to hiring metrics? We all can relate to that particular dynamic, right? They're in 6-month intervals that we don't know if we're going to be employed after the contracts, or whether we go to the next level of assistant to associate to full, right? Which brings me to, am I responding or reacting to employment, micromanagement, and termination? Right? We can all have elements, we can all agree that that's something that we constantly have lived with in terms of income and job security as Indigenous scholars. Am I responding or reacting to, or am I pushing back against how my priorities are set out by worship of the written word? When I'm constantly left with, well, what happens to our reality in terms of Indigenous knowledges in this particular paradigm of the academic industrial complex? Am I responding or reacting to paternalism when I'm faced with, I actually know who the decision makers are, and it's clear that it's not me. And it's clear those with power, and unclear to those without it, right? Am I responding or reacting to either or thinking? And as gender diverse folks, we recognize binaries are an extension of, heteropatriarchy. Things are either good or bad, right or wrong, with us or against us, right? Am I responding or reflecting on fear of open conflict? Right? My particular Injilkan teachings are that conflict is not a bad thing. It's actually an opportunity to enhance relationships. But yet I'm in institutions where they have this fear where folks in positions of power, decision makers, are scared of conflict and they try to ignore or run from it, right? And how do I push back? And how do I respond or react that I'm expected to participate and engage in individualism as an Indigenous Kinskillo person who's Two-Spirit, non-binary, disabled, when all those communities are about community and others, right? And that I am complicit and complacent in having to engage in competition, right? Where competition is highly valued rather than cooperation, right? That speaks to what I brought last week in terms of relationality. Like right? And little time or resources devoted to developing skills on how cooperation happens, right? So if it wasn't clear, I'm an abolitionist. I'm a harm reductionist. I want to find ways for you to stop perpetuating 10,000 harms against me and all the communities that I have membership with and that I'm accountable to. That these systems are not working. They're doing exactly what they meant to do, which was pit me in opposition towards Sandy and Maddie and Taima and Bronwyn and Lynn and the folks here who are taking time out of their evening to spend with us in conversation and dialogue, that it was actually set up to gaslight me, to have me feel that what I'm not doing, I'm an imposter, that if I just pretend to be that Indian, I can belong in your cupboard, right? So what's important to my discipline? Well, I'm not in my discipline because my discipline is an ongoing project of colonialism. Why? Because social work is a colonial project in that it already started to exclude Black and Indigenous people at its inception. As Indigenous people, we go back to the creation story. Well, those folks were making way for settlers to come from Europe. They were doing friendly visits. They were doing settlement houses for expansion of resources. Not much has changed because Black and Indigenous people are overrepresented in child welfare, and these systems are multi-billion-dollar industries that need ongoing trauma and suffering to continue to exist, right? Making me, the Indian, come in to schools of social work to teach a brand of indigenization is not working. Why? Because you're giving me kicks and you're making me stand in the same shoes that you want me to sell, so people can continue to remove children and break up families, right? But yet when I stand up, it's as if my shoelaces are tied, and what happens? We trip. So you're having me actively participate in the dismantling of Indigenous childhoods, notions of family and communities, and removal and dispossession from lands. So the discipline of social work is existing as it always should and does by continuing to cause harm and trauma to families, communities, and nations. That's its legacy. So maybe that's not why I'm in the School of Social Work, right? And I'm in Indigenous Studies, and that's its own bottle of worms. What is important there? That for the first time in over 20 years, I actually get to teach in my scholarship that I'm not perpetuating trauma porn, that I'm actually talking about resurgence, not resilience, because resilience says non-Indigenous people get to have their boot on my throat, and I get to still stand up and look how strong I am, or look how strong our families and communities are, without looking at the impact of the boot and the systemic and structural reasons why that boot is on my throat and the throats of our communities, families, and nations. So the work that brings me joy is things that community directs me. Now I've been sadly and unfortunately someone who's had to actively work at bringing attention to thousands of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit trans folks who've gone missing in the nation state of Canada. I've been the writer for a sub-working group that a document's going to come out, and I can only hear the relatives, my two-spirit trans elders, young folks, because in my internal governance system, the young folks are your elders, say that, Percy, what is this document going to do for us? I said, these words need to be said and they need to be shared. But is that going to help the fact that you are at such a higher risk of suicide, mental health, distress, houselessness, job insecurity, access to lands, access to elders who don't dead name or misgender you? I don't know. This is why it took one way for us to get here in terms of ongoing colonialism. There needs to be multiple interventions to help us get out of this hot mess. And this is one of them. So when this document is to be able to be shared, I hope that folks are able to see themselves reflected in the ways in which harm continues to happen, and the ways that people on the ground are able to sustainably support and create communities of care without calling the police industrial complex, which by the way are not safe, and spaces and places for us to call to be protected. Because also this week, this season is also a reminder of all the Indigenous folks who were harmed and consequently lost their lives by coming into contact with the prison industrial, like the police industrial complex and the police. So I think what brings me joy is being able to be seen and heard and in conversation, and people not silencing me and my critical voice, because of one of the many voices that have been silenced for too long. So that's a little bit about me. That's a little bit about what I do. And that's a little bit about what I'm constantly reflecting. Do I respond or react to this ongoing project called the academic industrial complex, and the ways in which I'm complicit and asked to replicate those same dynamics that happen to those who have gone on before, those who are still here, and creating space for those who want to come into these spaces after me. Limlam, raise my hands up to you folks.
Thank you so much. That was really powerful. I wish that I had some sort of a response that suggested that everything that you said wasn't also true here. From the information about disciplines to the academy to how we're treated, it's shocking, right? But it's also, as you say, exactly how it's designed. I think the space of resistance is all of the work that you talked about, but also the work that we're doing here. So I'm going to turn to Professor Bromwell Carlson now. I managed to get so overexcited about talking about being Wiradjuri, which I love talking about, that I forgot to mention that I'm actually a professor at Macquarie University, working with Bromwell and Maddie in the Department of Indigenous Studies, and I'm really so grateful to be there. Bronwyn, I'm going to ask you that same question for you to introduce yourself, but also to think about the pressing issues across your field or community, and really what it means to you, but also what change you affect.
Wow, so that's a hard act to follow. Thank you, Percy, who raised so many things that just resonate with us here. So we hear you and we really understand your position. And I wish we had some answers for that as well. So I'm Bromwell Carlson, and this is my first week joining the group on these webinars. Of course, I've been a part of the group since the beginning, and like everyone else here and the rest of the group, this is a real highlight to come together and talk to Indigenous people around the world who we share this ongoing battle. We understand the boot. We know that, and what Percy had spoken about. So I am a professor of Indigenous Studies at Macquarie University. My pronouns are she and her. At Macquarie, we're on the lands of the Wallumattagal people of the Darug Nation, and I'm a guest there, and I very much appreciate being able to work on those lands, as well as work with Darug people and with Indigenous people from other nations. I've been a guest most of my whole life, really. I was born on and live on Dharawal lands. My mother was born here and raised here, as was my grandmother. My great-grandmother came from South Australia, so we're descendants of the Nukana people. And I spent part of my life also in Aotearoa. My partner is Ngāpuhi from Waima and Omanaya in the North Island. My children are both Aboriginal and Maori. So I feel like my life is a guest. And I hope, and one of the things that I attempt to do in my life as a guest across this continent, but also in other places, is to always make sure that I centre Indigenous people, and particularly the people who are most marginalised within our groups, which of course is part of the reason this group was formed, is that the people who are most marginalised, of course, are Indigenous women and Indigenous non-binary peoples, queer folk. So for me, it's a big part of what I try and do in my academic life. So at Macquarie University, for example, we established the first Indigenous queer studies units here in Australia, and that came out of the work of one of my fabulous PhD students and colleagues, Andrew Farrell, who we hope will come and join our group. And of course, the fabulous work of other scholars, including Sandy and of course Maddie in our department, who continue to make those units so valuable to us. And they really speak back to the marginalization of those voices when we look out to all the other institutions and nobody else teaches from that perspective. And so using my position as a professor to enable that is really rewarding for me, I think. So Indigenous studies for me, I'm a professor of Indigenous studies, but I was trained in sociology. So I totally understand what we're talking about disciplines. Sociology has not always been interested in Indigenous people other than as objects to study. And I find as an Indigenous person in that discipline, I feel like I'm always on the outside, always on the margins, and never really allowed in the center of anything important. So, and I wrote about this in the edited volume that Timer did, and Sheila did, and a few others who participated in that volume. And I can't think of the title right now, so I hope you jump in and give that title of the book. But I wrote about Indigenous people as killjoys, drawing on the feminist scholarship around being a killjoy and what it means to be an Indigenous person in the academy and how we always have to do better. So I was drawing on the work of Martin Nackett, who was my PhD supervisor, who wrote this article about being better and saying how Indigenous people have to always do better, be better, will never be seen as the same level as others. And so I feel that my trajectory in academia has always been with that in mind, that we constantly have to do better. And so I gave an example in that publication, which was about how I, published a book, I got grants, carried on publishing, developed curriculum, did all of these things. And when I asked to be on the research committee, for example, my interest in research, particularly Indigenous research, I was directed to the Equity and Diversity Committee. So that's when I understood that it didn't matter what you did in this institution, and I think Percy probably articulated this much better than I can, you're always ever going to be just Indigenous. And I don't mean just coming from our perspective, I mean just in their eyes, the eyes of the boot, as that's what you're always going to be. So you're never allowed to rise above a particular station, because indigeneity in their eyes will always treat you as if you have some sort of anchor. It's never going to allow you to rise in whatever you might be, what rise means, right? So it might be whatever. It doesn't have to be just necessarily following a particular pathway in academia. So I guess my interest in scholarship is around the politics of identity, and I published a book on that. And I was always really interested in the way in which colonialism and settler colonialism dictates who it is who counts and who doesn't count in the way in which we understand who we are. And so here in Australia, of course, there's this whole history where, you know, there's a whole bunch of social sorting about who we are and who we can be. And so I was really interested in that violence and how that plays out, stopping some people feeling as if they can actually be wholly Indigenous in this landscape. So blood quantum is used horrifically here, and it still continues to this day. So we see media personalities, for example, like Andrew Bolt, who will come out with publications saying that people don't look Indigenous enough to claim indigeneity. Therefore, Indigenous people are only saying they're Indigenous when there's financial benefits. I'm not sure what they are, financial benefits attached to that identity. So I was hugely interested in the way in which settler colonialism then positions us and who we can be. So I'm not talking about the way in which we understand ourselves. I'm talking about the way in which the rest of the world understands us. And so that's led me to some work around our digital lives, in which I've been really interested in the last sort of decade. I've been looking at Indigenous people's social, cultural, political and intimate relations and engagements on social media. And I'm just about to finish a book with my co-author, Ryan Fraser. The book is called Indigenous Digital Life, The Practice and Politics of Being Indigenous on Social Media. And that book covers a range of topics. And one of the most recent topics I was writing on is, of course, fun. Because one of the things that interests me most in this space is the way in which our whole humanity is never really given any consideration. So we're a problem to be solved in the most part from most disciplines. So they look at us, how can they solve what's wrong with us? And I guess in some ways, even the academy, that is the way it is. They tick a box to have Indigenous studies because it solves a particular political problem in the landscape. But I guess for us at Indigenous Studies, we've taken hold of that ground and we see it quite differently. And we make that our little sovereign space on the 4th floor of the new arts precinct. And dare anyone say it's not our country. That's definitely ours. So in the social media stuff, so this last week I've been writing about the lack of notice, attention, care of mainstream media and politics in regard to missing, murdered, and the deaths of Indigenous women in their homes, whilst incarcerated on the streets. Whilst at the same time writing this chapter on fun, which really to me demonstrates the kind of crazy way in which we have to operate across the range of topics. So turning one day to a thing on fun, to the next day to the horror that plays out in the digital world around missing, murdered Indigenous women, girls and non-binary folk. So I guess that's my interest area. I guess that's a little bit about me. I get to work with fabulous colleagues. I get to work internationally with fabulous colleagues, including everyone who's here today. And for that, I'm ever grateful. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I've had the great privilege to read that wonderful chapter, and I can tell you it's fun to read. It really is. But it contributes to the scholarship like nothing I know, like nothing I've ever read, because so little has been written about those positives, you know, and that's really, really understood it from an Indigenous perspective. So I'm now going to throw to Sheila to ask these same questions around the pressing issue in your field, and of course an introduction to you and the work that you do and what you see your role as in that way. Thanks.
Miigwech, thank you, Sandy. And I'm going to start with introducing myself. So Bojo Kwekwe, Semakwe Dishnakaz, Makwado Dam, Temiagama Anishinaabe. So my spirit name is Tobacco Woman. I come from the Bear Clan and I come from the people of the Deep Water. And I'm located here in Atitmishing Anishinaabeg, Niswakmak territory, which is the home of the Atitmishing Anishinaabeg, but otherwise known as Sudbury, Ontario. And I'm kind of at loss for a moment after Bronwyn and Percy. It's so fabulous, honestly, to be amongst so many Indigenous academics and be able to have the conversations that we've been having that led up to this series. And I think what's been the most meaningful is being able to connect with people across the world and realize, and I think I realized this before, but I think when you're sitting around with a fairly large group, that in many ways we're connected by some of our beliefs, our spiritual beliefs, connections to land, but also to kin, but some of the difficult experiences that we've also had and the challenges that we've experienced, not only in our day-to-day lives, but just trying to survive in academia on a day-to-day basis, and the challenges that we're up against in doing that. So I think when I think about what led me here into the work that I do, which is largely focused, I would say, around trying to address ongoing colonial violence, and in particular racism in the academy that it exists, and I name it very specifically as a violence. When I did my PhD work, that's what I found, was that most of us experience different forms of racism. Sometimes they're very cleverly disguised, but they're still there. And I think I said this last week when we were talking, you can feel racism before you actually can see it or name it. You know that something's wrong with it. And maybe just a little story that will probably resonate with a lot of people. So when I was growing up in the 60s and into the 70s, we were mixed race kids. So my father is Irish and my mother's First Nation. And so we didn't really grow up on the reserve, but we grew up fairly closely connected to my mother's family and to a small First Nation that was close by. And my father was essentially disowned from his white family when he married my mother. And so even though he actually came from quite an affluent family, we never really grew up knowing them or knowing who they were until I was probably into, being about 16 or 17 before I actually even had connections with them. And even to this day, if I met them in the streets of Toronto, I probably wouldn't recognize them, or nor they would recognize me, because we don't maintain any kind of connection. So I grew up mostly with my mother's family and those strong connections. But, growing up, it wasn't always easy either, because we grew up away from a First Nations community. And I've told this story a number of times, but, the bus rides to school were probably the most traumatic things I ever faced in my life. Because my brothers were tormented and harassed because they were Indigenous every day and treated basically like they didn't matter or their lives didn't matter. I think because I was quote unquote a girl, I didn't face the same kind of physical violence, but certainly on an emotional level, I faced extreme forms of kind of bullying and harassment on those rides to school. And I can remember looking, over the bus seat, looking at the bus driver to do something about what was happening to my brothers, and him not doing nothing, and me feeling helpless. And probably as I grew up, I felt guilty for not doing anything, but I was still a child of, 7 or 8 years old. So as an adult, I came to reconcile that wasn't my fault. But you carry a lot of that, right? You carry whatever the shame that goes with it, and being put down. But in other ways, it led me to the work that I do now, which is trying to address the racism and the systemic racism that still exists in the school system, and in any kind of form that it exists. And it doesn't matter if it's anti-Indigenous racism. I find myself being a strong advocate for various forms of racism: anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, which we've seen a lot with COVID. So you know, so those things are what are important to me, you know, like in terms of addressing. I really do think that people should be able to just be able to come into places in the academy, go to school, get their education, and should be able to bring their whole selves to that, whatever their whole self is, you know, and so that's where most of my work lies. And so even when I was working in specifically in the Indigenous portfolio, that's where I worked. Now I'm focused mostly on equity types of initiatives in a more broader sense, but I still at my core, that's where what I fight for. And there's many issues that are important out there and pressing to the community. And I'll just name one that's probably on the minds of a lot of people that do work in this area, is that the impact of the pandemic has disproportionately affected Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as other marginalized groups. It's almost like it's brought to surface all the inequities that exist and all the violence that exists. I know we saw a huge rise of anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, both in the US and in Canada. And even though Canada likes to think of itself as very kind of a very great place to live, and it is in many ways, they're not exempt from the high rates of violence that Indigenous and Black and people of color face in this country. And so I think one of the pressing issues in our community, and there's a lot more, is around the impact that the pandemic has had on our communities. And I think that's going to go on. It's gone on for the last year, and I think it's going to go on for another for years to come, that we're still going to feel the fallouts of that. So I'll leave it there for now, but I just do want to reiterate how grateful I am to be a part of this group and to have been invited into this space and be able to share some of our experiences, but also I think to have the supports of colleagues from around the world. So miigwech, thank you.
That was so powerful. Thank you so much, Sheila. I think this whole idea of, I'm really moved, this whole idea of us all being able to share this, but also recognize the kind of strength in genuinely having very different sets of issues that are coming up. And then some of these just being so bizarrely shared across our very diverse landscapes is, you know, has been a powerful measure of this group. I'm going to throw to the fabulous Maddie, who I also get to work with. Maddie, if I could get you to reflect, and I know that, you know, you are an emerging academic, an emerging researcher, and I'm wondering if you can tell us about what you see as the pressing issue in your field. Feel free to talk about what you're going to do for the next 40 years, if you like. And, you know, what does it mean to you to be doing that work?
Thank you, Sandy, and thank you everyone for inviting me to be here today. You know, what an honour to be at the table with academics like yourselves. So my name is Maddie. I'm a transgender and intersex person. I live on Gadigal country in inner city Sydney, in New South Wales, in so-called Australia. I'm the grandchild of Jimmy Lambert, who was raised in the Little Bay community, which is kind of maybe the easiest way to describe it is more like an Indigenous diaspora community in eastern Sydney. And I'm also the grandchild of Barry Day, who is a descendant of the Googul Yalanji people of far north Queensland. So I suppose for me, listening to all of you speak, I can connect to every single issue almost so far. I would also categorize myself as abolitionist, and I think that I position myself in that way specifically because of my own disenfranchisement and the harm done to me by colonial gender specifically, but also by the medical industrial complex as an intersex person. And also, I suppose, experiences of criminalization as, you know, a transgender person who's also previously been involved with sex worker communities in Sydney too. So I can connect to all of these issues both personally and more recently as an academic as well. And really, I would say that I was brought into academia by Indigenous women and queer people, and I'm kept in academia by Indigenous women and queer people like Professor O'Sullivan and Professor Carlson. So I suppose all of these are the most pressing issues in both my academic work and also my personal life. And for us, I think it's very difficult to separate out the two, as we can hear from the reflections from everybody today. In terms of my future, I think what I see my work as intergenerational. So right now I see myself participating in a way that is learning from or learning about and witnessing and bearing witness to the challenges, but also the leadership of that Indigenous women and queer people and transgender people exhibit. So I suppose in terms of thinking forward, I'm thinking forward as carrying on perhaps a legacy, which that legacy in my setting is definitely in terms of Indigenous education and Indigenous academia. That is a legacy that has been really built by particularly Indigenous women, but also Indigenous queer people as well. I think that's me. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much. I think it was Percy who before noted that it's pretty powerful that actually of the group of people here, 3 of us are non-binary. So yeah, there's a power in that, and there's a power in the support that people are providing as well. If I can now turn to Timer. I'd love to hear more, and I was thinking this after you spoke last week. Actually, I'd love to hear more about what you see as the really pressing issues in your field and across the community, but also what role you play in that work.
Thanks, Sandy. Wow, I just want to have a lot of respect for the stories that have gone before me, and thank you for helping me grow and understand better. So when I was growing up, I used to be called a daydreamer. I used to always stare out the window. I was always thinking about something. So here's a good example. I was told to go to the shop to get, say, butter, bread, and something else. Halfway through, I always forgot what it was, and I always came back with something that was different. And for like weeks on end, my mum used to say, "What is the matter with you? Oh, take note, write it down." And then I would forget where the note was in my pocket. And I used to think that I was a failure. And in fact, some of my teachers used to say that you can't do that. That doesn't make a lot of sense. You got to concentrate. Anyway, the good news is that I didn't listen to what they all said, but so I wanted to kind of start this part of me about the way in which I like to reach out to my colleagues or my students. When we're in a difficult situation right now at Laurentian University. We've been declared insolvent. And, the first week we were in shock and horror because you don't know if your jobs are going to be there. You don't know if your students are going to finish their degrees. You don't know what happened and why. And you start this kind of journey about reflecting on how did this occur and where's the money gone and why did our senior leadership, leave us in this state. So you go through the second week and the third week. Anyway, so we're pretty close to finding out shortly if our university will survive. And we're pretty close to also knowing if we're going to what we call a Laurentian number 2, which is a brand new version of a reinvented self. So part of me has been listening to a lot of our students and a lot of our colleagues who are very stressed and have a lot of anxiety about that. But you know what I went into was my daydream mode. And I was thinking, what would it look like if we were to start anew? You know, we don't have to carry on that racism stuff anymore. What would this opportunity be for Indigenous? Can we reach out to Indigenous studies and Indigenous social work and be a family and a group? Can we find different partners amongst sociology or psychology? You know, what about that? I know I'm a daydreamer. I get that. And even my students, when they have a lot of anxiety about, will I have a real degree at the end of this? I always say, well, you know what, if you have that degree, you can go on to something else. And in fact, I have to declare that my students are doing an assignment on these webinars. So I kind of want to say I would get worried for that. But then I want to say too, but there's a sense of optimism in me about what can we do that's different. And I think that's why I like this group. We know our stories, we know what's happened to us, and many of the stories that have been shared already are my story as well. But then I also have to fall back to this natural, organic self of me, which is I am that octopus and I am a daydreamer, and it's okay. And I'm also a full professor. I write, I read, I can do all of that stuff. I know my history, and what I really want to be is a really great ancestor. That's what I want to be. I don't know if I answered your question, but it doesn't matter, does it?
Yeah, you sure did. Especially that last part, because I think that whole idea of daydreaming, I saw everybody nodding along and enthusiastically, that idea of imagining is so crucial to us as people who inhabit this space. And I'm not talking about as intellectuals, I'm talking about as intellectuals in spaces where we have to engage resistance. So, I mean, it's powerful to be able to push others out of boxes that they have made for themselves that continue to attempt to contain us. So, I mean, I think it's incredibly powerful. Thank you. Wow, this has been an emotional morning for me. Lynn, can I ask you to give us some reflections on this idea of the most pressing for you issue in your field or in the community? Maybe they're the same thing, and what it means for you in terms of the work that you can do.
Yeah, sure. I'm listening to everybody. I want to say what Percy said, right? What all of you have said, and it's really sad that even 20 years later, we're still talking about the same thing. There might be more Indigenous scholars, but it's so nuanced now, right? And the challenges we face in academia, but elsewhere, and can you imagine if we could actually focus on our areas of scholarship and not be fighting the institution constantly or our colleagues? But I think, when I did my PhD and I would talk to other Indigenous PhDs coming up, there's always something that you have to fight for within your research that's not related to your research, but you have to do it because you're actually pushing the boundaries of the colonial academy to try to make your work fit, right? And that becomes the focus, not the actual topic, right? So, my area my area is healthcare, right? And how, the healthcare system is literally killing us. The healthcare system has literally killed my family members, literally, like overdose given from the physician. And I can't do anything about it, right? So, you think about Brian Sinclair, who was a man who sat in emergency for 36 hours. He simply needed his catheter changed and antibiotics because they had an infection, and he died in his wheelchair while people just simply walked by. So that's my area, is the healthcare system and how it's literally killing us. And a lot of the work that I do now is in administration, and I talk to people who are wanting to come into the institution, and we can't guarantee that they won't be harmed by anti-Indigenous racism. We can't. It's almost a guarantee. It's almost a guarantee, and we have to manage that. We have to damage control, right? Because these colonial academies, as I said before, I'm not about decolonizing it, but I'm about trying to make the path as least harmful to Indigenous students in particular, and Indigenous people. But there's also lateral violence, right? Or if you want to call it crabs in a bucket, that we don't talk about, right? We don't go there. We don't want to air that laundry. But it's, the harms that exist in the academy are nuanced with that lateral violence, right? Like people said, like, are you looking Indian enough, right? Or are you Indian enough? So I just want to emphasize that, and like hearing everybody's story, that we're constantly fighting the academy. But with Indigenous healthcare, I really want to focus on our traditional healing, right? But it doesn't belong in the academy. It can't be in the academy. The academy cannot be responsible for accrediting our traditional ceremonies. But as far as people becoming, living Bamatsuan, right? Like living in a good way, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, right? It's our ceremony that we need to go to, right? My sister Kim, who was OD'd by a methadone physician, she just started to try to go to ceremony. She wasn't approved to come down to Toronto to speak to a healer. She couldn't get the approval, the financial approval, right? That's the work that I want to try to do, is how can we get supports for people to go to traditional healing lodges, right? So when we look at detox facilities and 28-day treatment programs, we know that doesn't work. If you've ever set foot in a detox facility, like, you're going to run out. If you can get in, you're ready for detox, right? You're literally ready. Oh, sorry, there's a wait list. So either you're going to detox on your own, or you're going to continue using, and maybe you will live, maybe you won't, right? These are the things that are happening in our communities. So I want to commit more time to that, but in all honesty, I have to remove myself from dealing with the harms of anti-Indigenous racism in the institution, because I don't have any energy or time to focus on what I really want to focus on. And I know I only look like I'm 29, but I'm really near the end for me, right? Like, my life expectancy with my family, I've surpassed my sisters already, and I'm going to be 55 in a few months, and my mom passed away at 56. So I want to leave this colonial institution sooner rather than later. And I want to be able to retire, right? Like, or have, because I worked so long for, well, not so long, but worked for this pension, right? It's a privilege to collect your pension, like to get to the age where you can actually collect old age security. And, we don't do that as many Indigenous people. We don't get to that point, right? So I want to try to be as healthy as possible and not be impacted myself from the harms of this colonial academy. So that's why I feel like this group is so important, where we can have conversations. But it's still sad. It's still sad that we are all experiencing this, right? I'll be on sabbatical next year, but I want to commit. There was a question we had. So when people register for the Zoom, they actually pose questions. So there's a question. I want to try to do another series of webinars and being inclusive of Indigenous academics. So there was a question about how we so rarely include African participants, right? Indigenous African participants. So, and you know, with this webinar series, we have North America north of the colonial border only, and New Zealand and Australia. So that's something that I want to try to commit to before my sabbatical, and then take a sabbatical and come back and see where I head after that. Miigwech, everybody.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. I want to try and get to some of these questions, but we've got so many. It's fantastic, and I think some of them will probably carry over. Some were answered, but you know, people might even like to pick them up as well. If I could just start by throwing out a couple that haven't gotten answers yet. Certainly the second time that's happened. I've got one by Erin Burrell, who's said, thank you all for the discussion. Can I ask how you are doing inside the academy, how the work you are doing inside the academy, the research journals and publishing processes enforced by neoliberal norms, I can read, I promise, are reaching your communities that exist beyond the academic space. Can I actually use this opportunity? I mentioned Dr. Tess Ryan before, who wasn't able to join us today, but actually asked for almost the same as this question, you know, posed this as a problem, that this wasn't the only way to disseminate, it wasn't the only way to conduct research, and it wasn't sometimes the best way to do it. And, you know, she really wanted to pose that to the panelists. And actually what was really intriguing was that many of you talked about everything outside of that context already. But does anybody have anything that they'd like to add to that? So it's asking about the work that you're doing and whether it actually ends up just being work that builds on what's already happened, or how you do any disruptions. And you may say that that's asked and answered, but
I guess I made a response to that question in the Q&A, and for us, I guess we do things always with our own communities and the broader Indigenous communities in mind. And so we try and do things that can be accessible to communities. And so I wrote in there about the Journal of Global Indigeneity, which is one journal, and I know Lynn also has another, but the journals that we're creating, and we're using the affordance of digital technologies to enable our knowledges, our ideas, our work to be accessible to people. Obviously that entails connection to the internet, but we also do things like community reports, which we disseminate, which are based on research, but just gives the key points that might be of interest to mob, because we understand, you know, a lot of people don't want to read a whole big jargon filled thing, which we do to meet the needs of the academy, that people just want to know what's the outcome, what happened, you know, how's that going to benefit us, I think, as Percy mentioned before. So we write little reports and things, and comprehensive reports that we can disseminate in hard copy as well. But the Journal of Global Indigeneity, we publish all manner of contributions, including video, including poetry, including creative works, other creative works, which also includes academic, more scholarly works, but blog styles. It's the voices of Indigenous people that are most important. And in that journal, we really try and promote the work of people who are trying to survive the system, which entails they need to be published. So we make sure we support that, as well as graduate students who are entering into the system and would like to publish. So we call them HDRs here across the world. It's people who are working on their PhDs and masters who think that publishing their work will be important. And the key thing is most of the work that Indigenous people do is actually, does actually come out of what's important to our communities more broadly. So, you know, that last edition of the Journal of Global Indigeneity, which we published, had 21 articles from across the world from Indigenous people, who some were scholars, some were students, some were working in all sorts of fields, who spoke about what was going on in their world in terms of COVID, how it impacted their world and ability to work and study and all of those kinds of things. And so there are 21 stories there, which is freely available for people to read about. And they were contributors from right across places where settler colonialism impacts our lives. And so we continue to do that. We've got a couple more editions. One is focused that I'm going to edit, which is focused specifically on this idea of sociology. And really it's a critique of sociology. So we're asking people to come on board and say, what is this stuff? Because Indigenous people have been doing sociology forever. We are interested in the world. We always have been, we always will be, and we continue to do so. So we are the world's sociologists in that sense. So yeah, we're encouraging people to contribute, so you don't have to be a sociologist. So yeah, I encourage people to look at things like the Journal of Global Indigeneity, and Lynn can speak to her health journal as well. But those are the kinds of ways in which we in the Academy have the ability to carve out Indigenous specific spaces and disseminate it to people who might be interested.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm just really going through the questions to see if there's anything that's a good one for us to finish off on, because we've only got a few more minutes. But I think one that was answered, but that might be really interesting for a few people to respond to, was actually one that was such an important part of how we all came together. Which is by Shirley Lawson, who says, as an Aboriginal woman, I had the privilege of having Bromwell as a key academic during my time at University of Wollongong, and was inspired by her to major in sociology. You're to blame. So I have since graduated and had aspirations to go into academia, but have distanced myself from this. What needs to happen within the tertiary sector to make the prospect of academia inviting and safe for First Nations mob to access and operate in? That was a big part of why we all got together, right? to talk about that, to talk about what it means to progress without that idea of all of us as competition to one another.
I was just thinking back again on my PhD supervisor, Martin, who said to me, if you know, once you become a professor, your job is to make spaces and places for other mob to follow you. And I've always kept that at the core of what I do. And I also remember when I started university, I went to a lecture and there was an Indigenous lecturer. I was like, what? That was the first time I'd seen that. And back in the day, that person didn't have a PhD, as many didn't. But now I can go to a lecture and there's an Indigenous professor. And that just blows my mind. I know I'm one as well, but it blows my mind that that's only a short, because I've only been in academia for 12 years. So from that time when nobody had a PhD around where I was studying to now, I'm looking around me and I'm seeing all these Indigenous professors, doctors, all that. It's just like blows my mind at just how awesome that is. So I encourage students, and Shirley is absolutely fantastic, to draw on those networks as we are doing here, to don't see Indigenous studies as something that's not a discipline or that is not worthy of your being in. And so I still see a lot of Indigenous people will be like, well, you know, can I do Indigenous studies? What kind of job will I get? Every job, because you will be really, really smart from doing Indigenous studies for one. But you know, they sort of think it's not a discipline. Is that going to be on my certificate? It's going to be on like, well, yeah, I hope it is, because it will definitely change. It's not, by the way, it won't be, but it should be. Look, Indigenous studies has so much to offer people, even, you know, non-Indigenous people, about the way in which they need to have a relationship with this world that we live in. And that's missing from a lot of those disciplines, which is clearly just about investigating us. So here we teach people relationality. It's about being, you know, in relationship with people, with our country, with everything else, with other nations of Indigenous people too. We teach them how to be critical and think, and to dismantle what they already think they know, and why what they know never really does benefit them either. So they need to understand the world a little differently. So yeah, I encourage Indigenous people to come to the Academy, but to come to places that have some support already existing too, because I'm tired of having to see young people recreate everything all the time just to survive in these places. And I think it's our job as professors to ensure that we can take some of that brunt because we've got a seat at some of the big tables, and that we also always push the agenda that Indigenous studies needs to be more. We don't need to do better, we already do the best. We need to be more in these institutions and have more space, more funding, more resources, more bodies to do the work that we do. So we need you, Shirley.
Yeah, we absolutely do. And I have to say that was so powerful to hear that, Bromwell. You know, I've been an academic for 30 years in August, and the first Aboriginal lecturer that I saw was me. And that's true of a lot of people who've been in the academy as long as I have. And it's not good. It wasn't good. It meant that I messed a lot of things up. It meant that I didn't carry into my teaching a lot of things that I should have actually. And, you know, I'm not criticizing myself. I know the kind of context of it, but that was the effect. And the effect wasn't great on growing and bringing others into that space in multiple different ways, including community that aren't necessarily even interested in being involved in universities, but that we have a responsibility to. So I think that's incredibly powerful part of it. Would anyone else like to respond to that just before we finish up? No, done and dusted. Thank you again so much. It's just been an absolute pleasure. We'll put up some links on Twitter to some of the journals that we were talking about so that you can see them. So they'll come through the official Twitter site, which is the International Indigenous Intellectuals. I've been searching III, and it comes up with us. So, and look, any questions that you have, we'll be doing a little bit of a mini celebration next week, not of the fact that it's my 55th birthday, but of the fact that it's the International Day of Transgender Visibility. So, and maybe a bit about the fact that it's my 55th birthday as well. Grand. Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate it. And please, if folks can come along to the next one, we'd love to have you. Anybody who missed out on seeing this, if you have colleagues that missed out, just remember that they can catch up with it on YouTube, and we'll post up that link as well. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.